Our Bible study today is on Daniel chapter 5, beginning at verse 23. Let us pray. Heavenly Father, as Belshazzar received the writing on the wall and was frightened, help us, Lord, to recognize the way in which the writing on the wall for us it can be frightening if we remain in our sin. But because of Jesus, who has paid for our sins, and through our faith, we have nothing to fear, for the judgment has been cast in our favor, and we have been found not guilty because of Jesus Christ. So, Lord, we pray for your blessing over our study as we learn more about how we might live in the kingdom of Christ rather than the kingdoms of the world, where people have lived away from your presence and denied you. In Jesus' name, amen. Okay, so this is finally the end of chapter 5, where we get to kind of the whole point of this chapter, which is the writing on the wall. And of course, that famous saying, to read the writing on the wall comes from this section here. So we've been talking about how Belshazzar, who is called the king of Babylon, historically was only the son of Nabonidus, who was the real ruler at the time, but because of his disagreement with the religious rulers of Babylon, and he tried to raise the moon and sun god above the god that was the traditional head of the pantheon of Babylon, which was Bel or Marduk, kind of like the Zeus of the pantheon. So he tried to change the gods, right? And that made people upset, and he was kind of, in a way, had no support in the city of Babylon. So he lived most of his time in Teman, which is in Arabia, which is like 75 miles to the west. So he was like ruling in absentia, right? He basically left his son in charge. So Belshazzar was not necessarily the actual ruler. He was a co-regent, but he's called king in the sense that, he was the guy who was in charge at the city at the time. But the actual emperor would have been Nabonidus, his father. Okay, so Daniel's not mincing. He's not trying to change history. According to the traditions of the time, he's correct. Belshazzar was the king because he was the one who he had to respond to when he had questions. And so and then it mentioned how in verse 10 the queen, which technically would mean that she was the queen of the actual ruler, so it's correct, but she would have been the queen mother of Belshazzar. And she's the one who recognized that Daniel was the only one who could understand the writing on the wall. And so we get to the section here, last week we ended with 22, where it's mentioned how Daniel says to Belshazzar that you are his son, that is the son of Nebuchadnezzar, which would have really been his grandfather, and it's showing that he's the descendant, or he was kind of cut from the same cloth, which was what was the kind of one of the main characteristics of Nebuchadnezzar in the first 4 chapters of the book of Daniel. If you could use one word to describe Nebuchadnezzar, what was it?
Narcissistic.
Okay, that's true, but I think it was probably a more closely related word to the way he acted.
No.
Arrogant, there we go, yeah. Or prideful, right? So he was full of pride. He was very arrogant. He thought he was the greatest thing that ever existed. I mean, he placed himself as the head of gold. In his dream, the head of gold was the greatest king that ever existed in all of history. And so, in a way, Daniel affirmed that in his interpretation in chapter 2 of the dream of the statue. And then he builds a statue of himself out of pure gold that he wants everybody to worship in chapter 3. So you can see that his arrogance just goes from bad to worse. And in chapter 4, it's when he has another dream, and Daniel's interpretation is that it's this great tree, and it's him, and it's going to get chopped down. He's going to be humbled. But the good news is that he's not going to be killed. So the judgment is played out by his rejecting God and his arrogance and not humbling himself. So God humbles him, right? And he becomes like a wild animal. He's living for years, probably outside. They probably kept him in the royal gardens to keep him from getting killed, but kept him out of the eye of the public. So really, his governors ran the country for up to, I would say, when it says he would be like that for 7 times, most likely it's not years, because there was never a 7-year period where he was out of commission, but there was a 4-year period where he was not doing anything when Egypt got tired of wondering what was happening and they rebelled, and then he finally came to his senses because he repented. It's Nebuchadnezzar, that is, and then he came down in a battle and he attacked and destroyed Egypt at that time. So that was in our notes when I talked about the maybe it was the notes from the previous one, but so he was in a battle and put the Egyptians in their place, and so he was a pretty arrogant person, but he learned his lesson. He at the end of chapter 5 he confesses that the God of Israel is the God of the universe, and he's the strongest of the gods. So he never stopped being a polytheist, but because he did confess the true God, we can see that he learned a lesson that Belshazzar did not learn, right? So when he calls him his son in chapter 5, verse 22, the son of Nebuchadnezzar, it's like saying, you are just as prideful. And so the first thing he says is, you, Belshazzar, have not humbled yourself, though you knew all this. That is all the stuff that he just talked about when Daniel was describing Nebuchadnezzar, right? So because the verses 18 through 21 talk about the whole, it kind of summarizes chapter 4. Okay, so, and you just imagine how much time has passed between chapter 4 and chapter 5, at least 30 years, right? So Daniel has gone from a middle-aged man to, now he's in his 60s, and then by the time you get to the Persian Empire, he'll be in his 80s. And so this section here is kind of like the transition. The judgment's going to be passed down upon Belshazzar for his arrogance. So let's read verse 23 and talk about what did Belshazzar, what sins did he commit. Somebody read verse 23.
But you have lifted up yourself against the Lord of heaven, and vessels of his house have been brought in before you, and you and your lords, your wives, and your concubines have drunk wine from them. And you have praised the gods of silver and gold, bronze, iron, wood, and stone, which do not see or hear or know. But the God in whose hand is your breath, and in whose are all your ways, you have not honored.
Okay, so this is a long verse, considering verse 22 was just a short sentence. But in this verse, Daniel proclaims 3 sins that Belshazzar committed against Yahweh. Okay, what would be the first sin?
Drinking from the goblets.
Okay.
Is that not number 1?
So desecrating the temple vessels, right? So desecrating them, committing sacrilege, right? So, we have to remember that everything that was in the temple was sacred. And the word sacred comes from the word holy, and the word sacred is like a Greek word, and then holy in Hebrew means to be set apart. So everything in the temple, the gold goblets, the gold chalices, the gold instruments were set apart only for use in the worship of God, right? So something is holy when it's set apart, right? That means that it is not to be used for normal circumstances. For instance, the difference between when Paul says in 1 Corinthians 10 and 11, he talks about communion, and the Corinthians were abusing this sacred meal because they were treating it like they would eat at home. And he says, you're eating all the bread and you're not sharing it with the poor people of the church, and you're drinking all the wine and getting drunk on it. He says, don't you have homes to eat in? Right? And that's a shock for him to say that, but it's true, because the whole definition of Holy Communion, it's set apart. It's a meal, but it's not the kind of meal that you just eat at home. You don't fill yourself up with so much bread that that you're exploding. like Thanksgiving. It's not, you don't drink so much wine that you're going to get drunk. That kind of eating and drinking is reserved for normal life, but for holy, set apart eating and drinking, it is only for the blessing of God's gift of forgiveness, for his participating with us in this communion, right? The word communion means being at one with, so we're at one with Jesus through this eating and drinking. So all the vessels that were used in the temple were similarly typological, right? So that means that they were foreshadowing what's going to happen in the New Testament. So if in and of themselves, a glass or a goblet is not, special just because it's used in the temple. But what makes it special is the intention, right? Where it's used with faith, with respect, and with awe. And so a person who desecrates that, it's not as if God is offended by the fact that a gold goblet had somebody toasting wine in it, but it's the fact that the people showed no honor to the Lord. And again, God doesn't need our honor. He doesn't need our praises. Contrary to some non-denominational theologians that say our purpose in life is to praise God. That is our secondary purpose. Our first purpose is to receive the forgiveness of God, because we can't even praise him if we're not forgiven. So God forgives us first. He gives us his love. And then our praises to God are our response. One of those is justification, God forgiving our sins through Jesus Christ. The other one is sanctification, which is our response to what God has done for us. So God doesn't care as much about the vessels as if he's offended, but it's because of the heart, right? It says in 1 Corinthians that whatever that we do without faith is sin, right? So without faith, every action is a sin. So faith is the only thing that makes things acceptable to God. So because Belshazzar had no faith, no trust in God, no reverence, no awe, no fear of the Lord, his eating and drinking out of the vessels, the goblets of the temple, was sinful and deserves punishment. Okay, so that was the first sin. So what's the second sin? So another note about that, because he talks about how you had the goblets of the temple brought to you, and you and your nobles and wives and concubines drank from them. So not only was he sinning, but he was leading other people to sin, right? So that's another. The reason why it's mentioning all these other people is because his wives and his concubines and his servants wouldn't have done this unless he had done it. So in essence, he's leading them to hell by his example, right? So that's why the Bible says, "Woe to you who are teachers, if you lead a little one astray, then it's better to be tie a millstone around your neck and be cast into the depths of the sea." So Jesus is talking about the Pharisees who are doing the same thing as Belshazzar here. He's leading people astray by his example. Okay, it's the second sentence is the second sin of Belshazzar.
Do not honor God who holds in his hand your life.
Okay, so that's actually the third sentence. The second sentence says, "You praised gods of silver and gold," and it goes on to talk about all the different types of metals and stuff. So praising lifeless gods, right? So is God jealous about these so-called other gods? It's as if he's like, no, don't be praising any other gods except for me. That's the kind of attitude that some people interpret this as, which is completely wrong. I don't remember last week I mentioned how there's righteous jealousy, right? Righteous jealousy is that God has every right to say that people shouldn't worship other gods, not because he needs to be admired or loved or worshipped, but because he knows that if we don't, that we're lost, and he loves us so much that to worship other gods is to go to hell, and he doesn't want that. So he's jealous for our sake. He loves humans so much that he doesn't want them to do something that will separate them from God in eternity, which is hell. So praising lifeless God. So, this is something that you find throughout the Bible. Let's just look at some of the commandments that Belshazzar is breaking. Whether he knew this or not is not really an excuse, because it says in the book of Romans that the created world leaves no excuse for people who don't acknowledge the Creator, right? You can't say, oh, I didn't know there was a God. You just look around, it says in Romans chapter 1, and you can see creation, and creation is so amazing, so great, so powerful. Scientists keep uncovering things that are so unlikely to have happened by chance that, the other day I was watching, I found a video that talked about the way in which cells reproduce, and the way that they're able to use, all kinds of, chemicals, and I don't know what are some of the names of the chemicals that are used in some enzymes, right? The different types of things that are inside the cell. The chances of the chemical combinations ending up with chemicals that will actually allow the cell to reproduce, there's only like maybe, I think the scientists were saying like maybe 24 different proteins that can unfold a cell for reproduction. But if you take the DNA and you figure out how many combinations are possible, the number was in the trillions. So you could take the DNA combinations and you can come up with 1 trillion different combinations, but only like 20 of them will actually work. So think about that. What are the chances of a cell developing the proteins that will enable it to reproduce? And then he said if you had a cell trying to create a new protein out of the trillion of combinations, there's not enough time in the known universe for that to ever happen. It would take more than the 13.2 billion years that scientists believe the universe existed. So if there are any cells that even exist today, the probability of them happening by chance is so unlikely that right there is evidence by science that there has to be a creator. It's designed. It's not accidental, right? So you can deny all day that there's no designer. That logically, creation implies a designer, a creator. You can call it what you want, but Romans chapter 1 says people are without excuse. We can't deny that God exists. Okay, so here Belshazzar is not really saying that God doesn't exist. He's just saying that the God of the universe is not as important as his so-called gods of gold, silver, bronze, iron, wood, and stone. But let's look at some of the verses, like I mentioned, where the Bible does talk about the worship of idols. Deuteronomy 4:28.
Worship man-made gods of wood and stone, which cannot see or hear, or eat or smell.
Okay, so here in Deuteronomy, God is condemning the people of Israel for their, he's telling them not to worship idols, right? So this is in the context of the people had wandered in the wilderness for 40 years, and then they're about to go into the promised land. So this is the new generation where God, through Moses, is reiterating the commandments. And so this is an explanation of what he's telling them, what they should not be doing. Like the first commandment, you shall have no other gods, and you shall not make any graven images unto yourself. Now, some Christian traditions divide the first commandment and the meaning of the first commandment into 2 commandments. That's why non-denominational churches talk about the first 4 commandments are the ones about God, and then they have to combine the last 2 in the traditional counting to make up 10, because the Bible doesn't say which commandments are which. It simply says there are 10 commandments. And so, I think in a way God's just, it's just a kind of humor, the God's humor of like saying, well, I'm going to give you commandments, and you guys can quibble about which ones are which, but let's get to the real point is, are you willing to try to keep them? And the answer is, we can't do it on our own, so we need to depend on God, who forgives us for not doing it and sent his son who did keep the commandments. Yeah, so again, Deuteronomy 4:28 talked about, how the people of Israel are going to go into the promised land, and it says there you will worship man-made gods, because they're going to fall into the sin. This is like a prophecy of what they were going to do. He's telling them not to do it, but he knows they're going to do it. And once they get into the promised land in the book of Joshua, it shows they were told to conquer the people and to wipe out the Canaanites, but they didn't. And as a result, they end up intermarrying with with these pagan individuals who worshipped idols and gave their children as burnt offerings to the gods and gave their daughters as prostitutes to the temples of Baal, and all these terrible things. And he says, don't do it, because if you do, you're going to be punished. And then they did it, and then the punishment came, and Daniel is the proof that the punishment finally came. You know, the destruction and the exile to Babylon in 586 was the fulfillment of this promise back in the book of Deuteronomy, that if you do these things, you will be punished. In fact, the rest of this section from Deuteronomy goes on to say, if from there you seek the Lord your God, you will find him if you look for him with all your heart and with all your soul. When you were in distress, all these things have happened to you. In the later days you will return to the Lord your God and obey him. For the Lord is a merciful God. God will not abandon or destroy you or forget the covenant with your forefathers. So he's saying, you're going to sin, but I'm not going to forget you. And that was true when they went into the promised land and the enemies attacked them. So then God sent judges to protect them. And that happened over and over again. Then later on, they had kings. And some of the kings were good, like David, but others were evil, like Manasseh, who worshipped idols, and God allowed them to be destroyed. And then when they go into exile, God's promise is that he will not forget them. So, okay, and then another passage about God's condemnation of idols is, let's see, where's my notes on this? Okay, Psalm 115, verse 4 through 7.
Their idols are silver and gold made by the hands of men. They have mouths that cannot speak, eyes but they cannot see. They have ears but cannot hear, noses but cannot smell. They have hands but cannot feel, feet but they cannot walk, nor can they utter a sound with their throats.
So there's a kind of a humorous description of what idols are like. And then, in the book of Jeremiah, there's a bunch of passages where he said, and Isaiah as well, I think, where he says, the idol maker, he takes a piece of wood, and then he fashions a god out of it. And then with the leftovers, he makes a fire and makes his dinner. So it's like, well, which is the god? The what you use for your oven or what you used for your worshiping, right? And he talks about how ridiculous it is. And here, the description of how these idols, that they can't hear, they can't smell, they can't feel, they can't talk, they can't walk. And one of the reasons why God never allows a graven image to be made in his likeness is because you cannot bring the God of the universe into a finite, the infinite God of the universe cannot be shown in a finite statue, right? So God forbade the people from doing anything like that. And so the temple in Jerusalem was the only temple in the ancient world that did not have an idol in it. Right? What was inside of the temple? There's only one thing in the very heart of the temple, the Holy of Holies. The Ark of the Covenant, right? And the Ark of the Covenant was just a box. And inside of the box there was three things. And these were the symbols of what God was doing with the people of Israel.
Aaron's staff, manna.
10 commandments, manna, a jar of manna, and then Aaron's staff.
Yeah.
Right, and so that showed, that was evidence of God's commitment to his people. First of all, his covenant with Israel, made at Mount Sinai when the 10 commandments carved with the finger of God into the tablets. Right, so there was 2 tablets because one was for Israel and one was for God. 2 parties in the covenant. They probably had the same 10 commandments on them. It wasn't that there was part 1 and part 2. And then, so the covenant God made, and his covenant can be summed up like this. I am your God, I will be your God, and you will be my people. Right? So that's the covenant. And so if they failed to be his people by sinning and not obeying him, then he no longer had to be their God. But he didn't break his end of the covenant, even when they broke their end of the covenant. So it was kind of a covenant that God was saying, I'm going to continue being faithful to my end of the bargain. I'll be your God, even though they have rejected him. And he was going to make it possible for them to be brought back into a covenant relationship with him by paying for their sins. And we see that all the way back in Genesis 15, when Abraham, God makes the covenant with Abraham, and he's put to sleep during the covenant ceremony. And because what he does is he offers the sacrificial animals, and he lines them up in halves in a path, and then a smoking fire pot of God appears between the animal sacrifices, and that shows that God is accepting the responsibility of the covenant for both himself and for Abraham, because Abraham is asleep, because God put him to sleep. And so remember the covenant, it would be, God says to Abraham, again, the same thing, I will be your God and you are my people. And so by making the sacrificial animals in pieces, you're saying, if I break my end of the bargain, may what happened to these animals happen to me. Right? It's called a self-maledictory oath. It's the same thing as children who say, cross my heart, hope to die, stick a needle in my eye, to make a promise. It's self-maledictory. If I break my word, then I deserve death. And so when Abraham sinned against God, he deserved death. But because he didn't participate in the ceremony, God did. God was taking his responsibility upon himself. So he's basically taking responsibility for both parties. So God is saying, if you, Abraham, and your descendants break my covenant with you, then I will die. So God sent his son, born of a woman, born under the law, to take the penalty of the law for us, as it says in Paul's letter to the Romans. And so this description is proof that God took care of the sins and the rebellion of God's people. But he still needs to remind us about these things, because each generation needs to answer the call about whether or not they want to be children of God, because there's no such thing as grandchildren of God. God does not save you because your parents believe in God. He only saves those who put their faith in him as his children. And so Daniel is proof that the exile worked, because he was brought back. The Israelites started worshiping God again, and yet he needed to be a witness to the pagan nation. And in the book of Daniel, Nebuchadnezzar comes to the same conclusion that Daniel does, that God, the God of Israel, is the greatest God. But he just can't let go of his idea that there are other gods. Belshazzar has dropped a level. He's like, I don't believe in God. Your God's not powerful, and I'm going to show how much greater I am by using using the instruments from the temple for myself. So sacrilege. Okay, and then we'll go back to the third sin of Belshazzar in Daniel 5, verse 23. It was that last sentence that you mentioned earlier. You want to read it again?
Okay, but you did not honor the God who holds in his hand your life and all your ways.
Okay, so on one hand, the sentence before is that you honored false gods, and then the other half of that is that you did not honor the true God. And he adds something to it, right? Besides just saying, that his sin was not honoring Yahweh, but he was saying you didn't honor Yahweh, who holds. It says it holds your life, but in the Hebrew it's actually the word nephesh, which means spirit or breath. He holds your breath in his hands. So God has the control over the life and the death of the king of Babylon. And Belshazzar doesn't realize it, doesn't honor it, doesn't care. Now remember, what was the circumstance of Babylon at the time that this handwriting on the wall happened? What was happening to the city when
Siege.
That's right, it's under siege by the Persians, right? The city is surrounded. They've been under siege for months, maybe a year, but they thought, no big deal. Our city is impenetrable, right? Anyways, nobody can get in. There's a big wall. The wall was up to 200 feet wide at some places, and it was very tall, right? So it said that the 5 or 6 chariots could drive along on the top of the wall at some of its widest points. And it also had the river, the Tigris River, flowing underneath it. So there was an unending amount of fresh water that they never would, they could run out of food someday, but they could probably, sneak people out and get some food in. I don't know. But with all that water, they probably weren't going to be in trouble. So, and I don't know if you remember how I described how the Persian army got into the city. They diverted the river, and then there was gates, so that even though the water was flowing under it, there was gates, so that in the places in the middle of the city where you can get the fresh water, you couldn't get into that area because the gates were there. But during this party, the gates were left open, and people were so drunk that they didn't close them at night. So they didn't notice that the water level was dropping. They didn't notice that people were sneaking underneath the water gates and came right up into the middle of the city. That's how it's going to happen. So Belshazzar is so oblivious because of his arrogance, right? And his arrogance, his idea of how do we save the city from the Persians is, let's have a dinner party and get drunk. Instead of, and then also praising the gods of gold and silver and stone and wood. So he's thinking that these gods will save us and protect us, and that he was a god himself, and anything he says has got to be perfect, right? So his arrogance is reaching such heights that God is going to have to bring him down.
Is this the same thing that happened in Jerusalem with Hezekiah's tunnel?
Well, in Hezekiah's tunnel, they tried to protect themselves from a siege by diverting the water back into the city so that they wouldn't run out. But that was a spring, right? The spring, it had a little bit of water, but we're talking about the amount of water flowing down that spring is like maybe 2 feet wide in a tunnel that only got knee deep. So, and it continuously ran, so you'd always have water, but it would still be a while to get enough water for all the people in the city. We're talking about, this is the river Tigris that is going through underneath the city of Babylon, and so it's a huge amount of water. But they diverted it, and then they snuck in underneath the gates, the water gates, and then they were able to attack it. So those three sins of Belshazzar: desecrating the temple vessels, praising lifeless gods, and not honoring Yahweh who controls his life. And so these things are evidence that he doesn't recognize what's happening. So Daniel is called, and he's the representative of the true God of the universe, and he's contrasting the true God Yahweh with the false gods of the idols of Belshazzar. Okay, and then we finally get to verse 24, which says, "Therefore he sent the hand that wrote the inscription." So Daniel's just describing what had happened earlier in the chapter when the hand wrote on the wall. And verse 25. Can somebody read that?
This is the inscription that was written. Mene, mene, tekel, parson. Okay,
so you all see that I made a little printout of what the inscription on the wall would have been. Okay, now the thing is that this is written in Aramaic, and the question is, why didn't the wise men understand what was the writing on the wall? Most likely, it's because of several items, several reasons, right? It's not because they didn't understand what the letters were, but the thing is that they were written in, Hebrew and Aramaic are using the same alphabet, right? So, but the meaning is in Hebrew. The letters were unpointed. That means that, so the letters that I have here, I have 9 letters in Hebrew or Aramaic on the top of this sheet here. And dividing them up is the key. Because, obviously you can't read Hebrew, but if you look at this, there are lots of ways of dividing up. First of all, the inscription on the wall wouldn't have had divisions. There was no word division, so you don't know how you divide it up, right? So, if you have you seen the phrase, let's see, there's no God. If you put the letters, there's no God, and in a row without any spaces, no, I see, God's nowhere. Let's see, God's nowhere? Yeah, and then, God's nowhere. That's the one I'm thinking of. If it says God's nowhere, and then you divide it up in a different way, it could say God's now here. Right? So God's nowhere and God's now here are completely different sentences, right? But if you put the letters in a row and you didn't know where the divisions were, you wouldn't know how to interpret it. So that's the reason why they couldn't interpret it, is that it was written in that the meaning was in a different language, in Hebrew. It was unpointed. That when I use the word pointing, that's in essence the vowels. Hebrew doesn't use the vowels. There's no vowels in this word here. This is just the consonants. And depending on how you put the vowels in, which are little dots, remember how Jesus said in the New Testament, he says, not a dot or a tittle will disappear from the law until the Son of Man returns. Just talking about Judgment Day, Jesus didn't come to throw the law out, the baby out with the bathwater. He came to fulfill it perfectly. So all the commandments Jesus kept. So the dots and the tittles are really the vowels, and those are called vowel pointing. And like there's a 3 dots underneath a letter is the letter E. A single dot underneath the letter is the letter I. A dot at the top of a straight line, which is a vav, it's the letter V, makes it a long O. So those are different ways that those dots can change the words. So the difference between the word run and ran, if you didn't know what the vowel was, those one's past tense, one's present tense, right? So the same thing as in Hebrew, changing the vowels changes the tense. So you don't always know what the word actually means if you don't know what the pointing are. But the original Hebrew didn't use the pointing or the vowels because native speakers already knew the context. They knew the language so well they didn't need those things. They could read it and they understood what it said. It was only after the fact that people who didn't understand Hebrew, they weren't native speakers, they didn't understand all the words, that they had to add the scholars added the points later. So it was in the 6th through 9th century that that Jewish scholars called the I'm trying to remember the name of the Jewish scholars in the Middle Ages, that they added the points to the Hebrew Bible that we have today, right? But before that, it was just it was implied, and people understood it because they understood the language better. So the wise men didn't know the language; they didn't know how it was supposed to be pointed with the vowels, and they also didn't know the word divisions. It's not because they didn't understand what the letters were; they could see them, but it's interesting, as I was reading some commentaries, that the commentators actually said that depending on how you divide the letters, you can come up with several meanings. So this sentence, this long word that I put on this page here, if you divide it up like just the first 2 letters as a word, and then use the other letters for other words, it could mean things like, who caused Persia to stumble? It could also mean, what shall I weigh, a half mina? It could also mean, whoever you are, Persia is insignificant. And then there's other scholars over the centuries who've come up with other, varieties of translations based on what the letters could possibly mean. So it wasn't that it was non-understandable. It's just that no wise man could agree with the other wise men what it meant. So if they all had different so-called interpretations of what they thought it was, and they didn't have a consensus, the king would say, well, how do you know this is right? This other guy says that this is right. So they just said, we don't know, because nobody could agree upon what it is. So that leaves us to the understanding that the reason that the inscription on the wall was mysterious is because the only way you could interpret it is through how? It's not like coming up with your own ideas. It had to be given to you. So remember how Daniel was taken by Nebuchadnezzar after he had the dream about the statue with the 4 types of materials in chapter 2. And and Nebuchadnezzar says, can you interpret this? And he says, no, but my God can. So that's what's happening here. Is the only reason he's able to do it is because of divine inspiration. Divine inspiration. That's his ability comes from God. He's the only one who can interpret it because God gave it to him. Okay, now, even though verse 25, it tells us this is the inscription that was written. It says, many, many tekel parson. Well, in my description here, I actually gave you 3 words. And so we don't actually know that he's telling us that the inscription included 4 words. It was most likely 3 words. So why is the first word repeated? Right. There we go. That's a good point. Most likely, because it said that the writing appeared on the wall, and then he says this is the inscription. What is happening here is this is Daniel's description of the writing on the wall. So I don't think it helps when, most Bibles, the editors of the translation have to put it out in English with grammatical markers. There was no punctuation in the Hebrew. So there's no colon, there's no quotes. None of those things are found in the original Hebrew. So we don't actually know. So I think most likely is that Daniel is reading the first word, and then for emphasis, he is showing how to interpret the three words by repeating the first word, because they didn't know which was the first word, right? So because if you have 9 letters on the inscription, and you don't know if this is, if I tried to pronounce this as one word, it would be Tekel Parson, right? But if you could think of it as men, which means from, or et, which is another Hebrew word that means towards. So he was showing how to interpret it by showing what the first word was. He divided the first word as 3 consonants. And so he's basically saying this is how you interpret it. 3 words of 3 consonants each. And that's a very common Hebrew verbal format. Yeah, it's just the way that in Hebrew, almost every Hebrew verb is a 3 consonant combination, right? And so he's Hebrew, he knows what it means, and he lays it out. And so the first word is just for emphasis, as well as to show how you are to interpret it. Now, of course, in English, it has more letters than in the Hebrew, because if you take the vowels out, you end up with again, it just depends on what the letters are, because the word many in English is M-E-N-E, and in Hebrew it would be, it's the first letter is M, and the second letter there is N, and the third letter is this, it looks like it's called an aleph, and it's the ah sound. So it's only in English it looks like a vowel, but it's a consonant as the silent H sound in the Hebrew. And it becomes like a consonant at the end of a word. So it's kind of a difficult way. But the wise men of Babylon didn't know the Hebrew, so they weren't able to understand what it was. Okay, and then he explains in verse 26, this is what these words mean. And so he tells us the first word, many. God has numbered the days of your reign and brought it to an end. Right? Verse 27, Tekel, you have been weighed on the scales and found wanting. In verse 28, Paris, your kingdom is divided and given to the Medes and Persians. Now, in order to explain this, you have to understand that that the words that are if you divide them into 3 words, right? You have 9 letters divided into 3 words, that the meaning is broken up into 3 levels. Okay? The first level is that each of these 3 words, and that's why I've divided them up on the bottom of the sheet here, as Mina, Tekel, and Parson. Each word has a literal meaning, right? And so you may have heard of the word of a Mina, or here it says Tekel, that's Aramaic, but the Hebrew word would be shekel. What is shekel? Anybody know?
It's like a coin.
That's right. It's a currency. Right. And in the ancient world, before the currency had a face value, the only way that it actually meant anything is because it was a weight. Right? So money was not used as coinage yet. It was as an amount. For instance, of gold, right? So if you wanted a shekel, it would have to be a specific amount of gold, right? And so all 3 of these words are actually measurements, weights, right? So at the first level, there's a literal meaning, and the meaning would be that the first one is Amina is. Let's see, I wrote down what these equal to. Okay, so Amina is like a Babylonian amount. Value that's worth 60 shekels. Then the tekel, or a shekel, is an amount of gold that is equal to a half, up to from half a month to a month's worth of wages. Right. So for today that could be like thousands of dollars. for a shekel. So a person's normal wages would be 20 to 24 shekels a year. That'd be a year's wages, right? So a shekel is, still pretty expensive, 2 to 5 weeks worth of wages. And then the last one, the word for parson is, you don't know Hebrew here, but the word here doesn't have an N on it, and that's because pars is singular, parsin is plural. And so that would mean that's a half shekel. So the 3 weights of measure here would be 3 to 5 years worth of wages, which is a mina, half a month to a month's worth of wages, a shekel, and then a half mina, which would be 2 years' wages. Now, what do you notice about the values of these 3 types of currency? What was that?
Goes up.
Does it? 3
Smaller.
to 5 years worth of wages, a month's worth of wages, and 2 years worth of wages. It's actually not in order, and because it doesn't go from the highest to lowest. It goes from high to low to medium. It's not logical. And so and this might have been one of the reasons why the wise men of Babylon couldn't interpret it, because even if they came to the conclusion that this weird long word actually was 3 words that equaled 3 types of currency, there was no order to the currency, so they didn't understand it. So, but there's a reason, because he's using types of currency because the secondary meaning actually is the real interpretation. Okay, so the literal interpretation, the literal meaning is types of money, right? And that's the level 1. Level 2 would be that each one of these is actually a verb as well. So if you take the letters for mina and you turn it into a Hebrew verb, it also means the word counted. If you take the word tekel, which is a type of money, right? Like I said, it's half a month to a month's worth of wages. And you turn that into a verb. The verb for tekel is the word weighed. And in the third word, which is the half a mina, if you turn that into a verb, it turns into the word divided. So I gave you the definitions of the words in the Hebrew, which is his interpretation. So those are explicit. The implicit name of the money is just what the word means. The explicit meaning is the Hebrew verb, which means counted, weighed, or divided. And then the explicit interpretation is his explaining what does this have to do with Belshazzar. Okay, so you can see that with those 3 different levels, only God could have given Daniel this information, and that's why it would have been so difficult for those other wise men. Okay, so what do you think? As we read through the definitions in the Bible, like verse 26, Daniel said that God has numbered the days of your reign and brought it to an end. If the word there for mina is the word, it's a verb that means counted, you can see here that the translators, and at least in the NIV, uses the word for counted and translated as numbered. Does anybody else have a different translation?
No, mine says numbered.
Okay, so ESV? Yeah, and is there anybody else using like a King James Bible or?
Wait.
Okay, so and that's in verse 26, right? Because in verse 27 it says that tekel means you have been weighed. Or does it use the same verb twice?
25 numbered, weighed, and divided.
Okay, so there's different ways of translating it, and the idea is that the Hebrew verb mana means to count, and then here his interpretation is that counted or numbered are your days, and your reign is brought to an end. The last part of that sentence, brought to an end, literally is the phrase. Let's see here. God has counted your kingdom and paid it out. So the last part of it, so what he's doing is he's using a word play, right? So the last part of that sentence where it says brought it to an end or weighed it out is still the same verbal form as the word mina. So the whole sentence, if you were to read it in, transliterate it in the original language, it does a word play, kind of like, she sells seashells by the seashore. The whole idea that you use the same sounds in the verbs and the nouns throughout the sentence. And Hebrew does that a lot. So to say that your days are numbered and your reign is brought to an end, the last part of that, brought to an end, is actually a phrase in Hebrew that means that he's saying that your kingdom was paid out. But to be paid out is as if a bank confiscated a property from somebody who wasn't paying their dues, and then they repossessed it, and then they gave it to somebody else who would pay the bank for it, right? So the idea could actually be the word repossessed. So if you think about it, the king of Babylon at this time, Belshazzar, he is in control of this huge kingdom, and God's saying, what have you done with what I gave you? The only reason you have any ability to rule is because I gave it to you, and you're squandering it. You're selfish. You're prideful and arrogant, and because of your sins, I'm going to repossess it. I'm going to take it back from you. And who's he going to give it to? That's right, Persia. Okay, and so that's the second part of this sentence, right? So it says, you have been weighed on the scales and found wanting, right? So the word tekel means to weigh. And like I mentioned, how money back then wasn't currency on face value, right? It didn't just have different pieces of paper with numbers on it. It was a weight, an amount. And the only way you could do that was with scales. So he's using this metaphor that just as you would take like a known quantity of weight and match that with an amount of gold, and if it came up short, then someone's trying to rip you off. Like if you were supposed to have like 10 ounces of gold, and I only gave you like 5 ounces of gold, and I say, oh look, that's gold, just take it. Well, it's coming up short, right? The weights are saying that you're not giving me enough, and you're trying to rip me off. So Belshazzar, the last part of that sentence says you're found wanting, but it literally means you are lacking in weight. That's what it literally means. So you could translate that as that you've come up short. That's another translation, come up short. So God is metaphorically weighing his character. So, and this is another thing I found in the commentators. They said that in the Talmud, right, which is the commentators of the Jewish rabbis through the centuries, and most of this was written between 200 BC and 200 AD, right? So the Talmud was the one that was a little bit later. But they said that quantities of gold, like the whole idea of like weighted shekels and stuff like that, it was often a metaphor of a person's character, right? Think about the statue that Nebuchadnezzar had the dream of in chapter 2. The head of gold was the most valuable, and that was his kingdom. And so his character was the greatest. And then the next one was silver, not quite as valuable, and that was the 2 arms of silver, which was the Medes and the Persians. And then the third was the waist of bronze, and that was the Greek Empire, and then the legs of iron, which is the Roman Empire. Okay, so it becomes less valuable. So the idea of the different types of weighing metals is a metaphor for weighing character. What kind of a character does Belshazzar have? His character is sinful, arrogant, and prideful. Okay, and then the third part where it says Perez, or something, depending on how you pronounce it, your kingdom is divided and given to the Medes and the Persians. So the original word for Perez is a word that can simply mean a half. It's a Aramaic word for a half of a mina. So that's like 2 or 3 years' wages. That's the literal meaning. The implicit meaning is it's a verb that means it literally means to break in two, right? So Perez, break in two. You can translate that as divided. So if you break something in two, then you've divided it, but kind of in a harsh way, right? So his kingdom is not just going to be broken in two; it's going to be destroyed. But it will be given to 2 groups. So in essence, the whole idea of using the word divided is showing that the empire that will follow will have a double influence. And so who is it? Yeah, it's the Medes and the Persians. And that's why he says that your kingdom is divided and given to the Medes and the Persians. And this is part of this last section is difficult for commentators because there's no evidence of, like in verse 31, where it says Darius the Mede took over the kingdom at the age of 62. There is nobody historically ever found with that name. There's a Darius who's a Persian who lived like 75 years later, and that's not the same person. And why would he call him Darius the Mede unless the whole point was that he was from the Medes as opposed to the Persians, right? And so understanding the connection between those two countries is important. So we'll finish off the paragraph or the chapter. Go ahead and read those verses, and I'll finish it. 29.
Then at Belshazzar's command, Daniel was clothed in purple and a gold chain placed around his neck, and he was proclaimed the third highest ruler in the kingdom.
So why do you think he gave him all that stuff after he was just told that he was going to be destroyed?
Kind of a waste of time, right?
Yeah, except that because he was so prideful that for him to break his word in front of his dinner guests was something that he just couldn't bring himself to do. Or maybe he thought if I'm going to be destroyed, it's not going to really matter. So if I give it to him or not, so I might as well just honor my word. So he was kind of caught, right? We don't really know. He could have been a person of such low character that he could have broken his word in front of everybody. But I think it's because of his pride that he gave it to him anyways. It's similar to what we talked about last week with Herod and John the Baptist. He didn't really want to kill John the Baptist, but because he told his guests that he'd give Salome, his stepdaughter, whatever she wanted after she danced, that he did it anyways. So that's the kind of thing here. And then verse 30 tells us that very night Belshazzar, king of the Babylonians, was slain, and Darius the Mede took over the kingdom at age 62. Now, I think I could probably spend an entire hour just on that verse, but I'll give you just a little bit of a wrap-up, and then maybe next week I'll talk a little bit more about it. So Belshazzar's condemnation happens within a 24-hour period. So just like the description of the writing on the wall says, your days are numbered, you've been found wanting, and your kingdom will be broken in two, given to the Medes and the Persians. So that's exactly what happened. And so he tried to escape because the Medes came in, or the Medes and the Persians came in through the gates of the underneath the river into the city, and they didn't actually kill everybody. They simply got in. They found the king, Belshazzar. He tried to hide in the temple of his god, and and he actually was going to commit suicide. If he would have killed himself, then he would have disproved the prophecy of Daniel, because it says that he was going to be killed, but instead, if he killed himself, it wouldn't have worked out. But what happens is that he was captured, and then he was executed by Darius in the temple of his god. So that came true. Now, we don't have any evidence of a person named Darius in the history of outside the Bible. But, this is something, first of all, that has been found over and over again. Just because we don't have archaeological evidence of something in the historical record doesn't mean it doesn't exist. We just don't have it yet. So, there was no Roman evidence of Pontius Pilate up until the late 1800s. And up through the 1800s, historical critical scholars claim that Luke made this up. There is nobody named Pontius Pilate. There's nobody. We've never even seen that outside of the Bible. So he was just from his imagination. Lo and behold, a description with Pontius Pilate's name was found in the rubble from the edge of the temple that had been buried after the Roman destruction of Jerusalem in 70 A.D. It was found in the 1800s, and so proved that, outside the Bible, that there was a real person. So I think that that's probably the greatest explanation of maybe who Darius is, that we don't know who he is from history outside the Bible because we haven't found anything. And most likely, it mentions him as a Mede specifically because it wants us to know that the prophecy of the Medes and the Persians taking over the city was true. Because wasn't it the Persian Empire that was mostly? Because remember, who's the person who was credited with the prophecies that would free the Jews and let them go home after the Babylonian exile of 70 years? Cyrus. And he's a Persian. So how is Cyrus the Persian going to be the one who freed the Jews when it tells us here that Darius the Mede took over the city? See, that's the question. And so for this to be biblically correct, the only answer is that Darius the Mede is Cyrus the Great, the Persian. Now, so I'll just a couple of things I can tell you, and then I'll unpack it next week. But Cyrus the Persian, the Mede, Cyrus the Persian, he's also called Cyrus the Great, is the one who actually took over after the destruction of this. And so it could be the same person, because Cyrus was actually his father was a Mede and his mother was a Persian. So he was half Mede and half Persian. And what he did was that when he took over, he basically rebelled against his grandfather and his father and took over the kingdom. And he combined the Medes and the Persian Empire because he had, because both of his parents were from different groups. And so he's the one who consolidated the kingdoms of these two groups in himself. But he always claimed to be a Persian, but because he had some Medes, his father's side was from the Medes, that is probably the reason why Daniel wants to remind us that the prophecy was true, because the person who took over was both a Mede and a Persian. And also, Darius is the only person in the book of Daniel whose age is mentioned. Why in the world would it tell us that Darius was 62 at the time that he took over? If you go back, when did the people of Israel go into exile? 70 years before this. So right after they went into exile, God started his plan to free the Jewish people. So it wasn't as if this just happened in chance. His age is listed in order to remind us that God had already been planning this almost since the beginning to free the Jews. And also his age corresponds even better with Cyrus's age. And so that's probably the clue that leads us to see that it is the same person. A lot of scholars, claim, this is ridiculous. You can't work it that way. Well, the main thing is that their argument is from silence. They say because we don't know, then this has to be wrong. It could just be as well that just because we don't have any evidence of Darius's name in history doesn't mean that it's wrong. Just doesn't mean it hasn't shown up yet. So I think that a generation from now might have the evidence, and people's Bibles in the future will say, the archaeological find in Persia found this inscription that proved Daniel to be true after all. So, just wait. Your children, grandchildren, great-grandchildren may have more to say about this. But I would say ultimately God knows what he's doing, and that this description here is showing that Daniel's prophecies were true, and that God had always planned from the very beginning to care for his people. His freeing his people from the Babylonian exile was already in place long before it ever happened. Okay, so we finished up chapter 5, and chapter 6 starts by talking about Darius, so we'll talk a little bit about him next week as well.